Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I had to shout because it's going through that thing there.
Sure.
It's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to Geoff Harcourt, who I've known for some years in various ways. Geoff, when were you born and where were you born?
I was born on the 27th of June 1931 in Melbourne, Australia, in the suburb next to where Barry Humphries was born. It was the heart of Barry Humphries' land. Melbourne was a stuffy, snobby and sectarian place there then. Now it's a real swinging city. I was born to agnostic, assimilationist, very right-wing Jewish family. And I was born with a twin brother who was a quarter of an hour ahead of me and has ended up an academic dentist, a reader in false teeth. There was a tragedy in the family which was not much spoken of, but the presence was there. We had an older sister who was a blue baby, who of course could be saved now, but who died at the age of 4, a year and a half after we were born. Of course, we were born at the height of the Depression, and that was the one time my mother, who was a very formidable woman, could not make up her mind when my father came in with a bucket and said, well, which one do you want to keep? And since I was a breech birth, I was just ideal to go in the bucket, but she didn't. But had she had what we call rational expectations in economics, I wouldn't be speaking to you now. I mean, my parents were very good and well-meaning people. My mother, who was the original Mrs. Portnoy, had convinced herself that she really was the descendants of English gentlefolk, and though her father, who was from Germany, had fallen on bad times very quickly after we were born. He was an extraordinarily wealthy man for a long time, and so she grew up in the upper middle classes in Melbourne, and Melbourne was a terribly snobby place where you went to school and so on was very important, and where you lived was very important. And her mother lived in South Yarra, which was old money, and the George girls were belles of the ball at Vice-Regal Society and so on. So there was a lot of non-intellectual upper middle class attitudes, very snobby, very anti-Catholic, and in my mother's case, basically anti-Semitic. My father was the son of shopkeepers. Three of my four grandparents came from overseas. My maternal grandfather from Frankfurt came out in the 19th century to avoid military service at the age of 14, a tradition which the family has proudly kept up ever since. And then my father's father was probably from Hungary. It's Transylvania, and it might have been Romania, might have been Hungary. But there is a town round about there that our son Tim has found, which is named after them, in the sense that I think it was just the meaning of the place. And his wife was from Poland, and then my maternal grandmother, they originally were Lithuanian Jews that came to England and then had been in Australia for a couple of generations before she was born. And they changed their names from Isaac to George. So that was our background. So we went to private schools.
Did either of your parents particularly influence you, do you think?
Well, I think, well, my mother influenced me by wanting to do everything she didn't want me to do, I suspect, poor woman. She was very possessive. I mean, she was terribly well-meaning. She was the headmistress of the infant school at Merton Hall, which was the poshest girls' school in Melbourne. She was a very powerful person, so that she was very good at controlling children. She wasn't very maternal or cuddly or anything, but we had very deep emotions. My father had been an Orthodox Jew until he was about 20 or so, and then he decided all religion was a load of nonsense. But he was a man of extraordinarily high principle and old-fashioned verities. He was a leather merchant, and that's a very crooked trade, but he was always regarded as an incredibly honest man, full of integrity. He lived till 96, playing golf till he's 94, and he was loved by so many people, including me, though we had terrible clashes because of my left-wing views and partly anti-war movement against Vietnam and so on. But deep affection was very... he understood what being a parent was. Support them when they're young and let them go when they're grown up, and he did that in an exemplary way. But there was he was very fond, as you can imagine, of young women, not having had a daughter of his own. So he was lovely to my wife, and there was another friend of the family who used to drop in and see him when he was a very old man. And when he died, she wrote and said, you know, it was a pleasure. It wasn't a duty. Your father was such a wonderful man that I liked to do it. So he greatly influenced me on proper values, as far as proper personal values. And I hope, and I think our kids would probably agree with this, that we've followed in Poppy's footsteps in how we've looked after them and been there as a support, but let them go their own way. I mean, my mother taught us to be efficient and all that, but again, I rebelled against that. And she, as I say, she was terribly well-meaning, and I mean, they saw anti-Semitism coming in Germany and all that sort of thing. There were still relatives on my mother's side in Germany. They came out on the last ship to leave Germany to Australia. So they thought that they were doing their best for us by pretending that we were, you know, C of E, and letting us go to the divinity classes and so on. Of course, it was hopeless because we had all these Jewish cousins, and it just wasn't successful, and it was a silly thing to do, and in a sense it denied us a birthright, which we otherwise, a very rich birthright, which we otherwise could have learned things from, I think. But I can't criticise them. I wasn't in their position for doing that. And it's interesting that all my immediate cousins have all married out. None of them have married Jewish partners. Not because they were anti-Semitic. I think they were just assimilated. Because they weren't Zionists, because they belonged to that part of the Jewish community in Melbourne which was anti-Zion. It was more the Polish and the Russians who were very Zionists and left-wing, and who were more working class than the middle class assimilated Jews. We were a very big community in Melbourne.
Right, well that's a very nice round, well, short-rounded picture. You mentioned you went to boarding...
No, we didn't go to boarding school. We went to, as day boys, to private schools. They had boarding houses, but those were for people from the country. And so I was brought up you know, very right-wing politically and very agnostic about religion, but very much interested in politics and religion. And we left our first school, our primary school, because it was falling apart during the Second World War, and went to Wesley College, which was one of 6 then public schools, i.e. private schools, that sort of ruled the roost in Melbourne. And from then, and again, I went to divinity classes, very interested in things. My twin brother was very, very bright, and I was dragged along with him, so we were a year and a half younger than the average age in our form, which stunted his social development and had a bad effect on my intellectual development. I only survived by copying his French and Latin and mathematical homework. And I remember the Latin master, who must have known what he was saying, but he was a very nice man. He said, "Can't understand you, GC. You and your brother JK do such excellent homework, but when you get to the exams, you get 45 and he gets 100. So I struggled along. I wanted to be a vet, and so I had to take science subjects, at which I was hopeless. It took me 3 years to get university entrance physics, which you needed as a prerequisite. But I'd done economics as a sort of fill-in subject and found I rather liked it. I was quite good at it. And I'd been inspired by some of my schoolmasters, so
Any particular one? Or?
Well, the physics master was very good to me, though he must have despaired of me ever getting it. And then there was an English master who also coached the Australian rules football. I'm mad keen on sport, and sport protected you from being persecuted as a Jew. I mean, my one excursion into journalism is an account of anti-Semitism at my school in Melbourne, which was published in 1960 under a pseudonym, because I didn't want to upset my parents. However, my cousin Richard, who was the older brother of this cousin I was telling you about who died at Heathrow, he said, said to my parents, have you read Geoff's article? He's a real stirrer, Richard. Very distinguished theoretical chemist, probably the brightest of all our immediate contemporaries of the family. So I'd done economics at school, and there weren't Commonwealth scholarships, but just as before I went to the university, they brought in scholarships for people who are going to be school teachers. So I thought, well, if I become a school teacher and teach economics, I'll save my dad, having to pay for me to go to university, because I'll get a living allowance, and I can do economics. And moreover, in those days you had to have a foreign language, because I was hopeless at foreign languages and maths and so on. And so the only subject without a prerequisite in foreign language was commerce, the Bachelor of Commerce degree. So I enrolled for that. And as I say, I'd struggled through to get my university matriculation, they called it. Excuse me. But then I started in 1950 the commerce degree at Melbourne, and I suddenly found that I was really amongst what I should always be amongst, and I came top of the year at the end of the first year, and I'd acquired a wonderful mentor called Joe Isaac, who was one of the lecturers there. I'm through Queen's College, of which I was an outpatient. I wasn't yet in residence. And he said, well, you shouldn't be a school teacher, you should really be a university teacher. So I resigned from the Secondary Teachers Centre, much to the disgust of the principal, because I was their prize boy by then, having done so well in the first year. And off I went for the rest of the time. I went into Queen's College, which was life transforming. In 51 I peaked. I came top of every subject, and they had what was called exhibitions, and that saw me through for the next year, plus working in factories or retail shops in the holidays. And then I think the next year I got a prize which allowed me to finance my last year, and I ended up getting the equal top first in 1953, at the end of 1953. And all the time this was going on, I took very full part in college life. I was captain of the cricket team eventually, played for football in the Australian rules football team. I was on the committee, the students' committee, which ran the college. It was a very laissez-faire regime in Queens. And I kept thinking about politics and economics. I'd very quickly become a socialist as a result of the lectures on economic geography, which is really comparative economic systems, which revealed to me that the world was the most irrational place with very different systems, but all characterised by being irrational, and none of them like 24 Faircroft Avenue, Glen Iris, SE6, heart of Barry Humphries land. So I within 6 months I'd changed from being a right-winger to a socialist, much to my parents' annoyance. It was bad enough having a son not being a doctor or a dentist, but actually had one doing commerce and being a socialist. My God, how could you hold your head up? But I didn't make up my mind on belief in God until my last year. There was a theological hall in Queens, and some of my best friends were training to be Methodist ministers. One I played billiards with every day, a bloke called Norm Young, who ended up as professor of New Testament theology in the theological school there. So I had endless discussions with them, and we had a lovely chapel with very interesting people going through it, and some very interesting people, both agnostics and believers in the college. So in the end I thought, I decided in a Popperian way, make the hypothesis, suppose it's true. I wasn't interested in personal behaviour. I was interested in personal behaviour, but I didn't believe in the evangelical Christianity, because That seemed to me to be unachievable. Think of poor Wittgenstein, who thought you had to be perfect before you could be a philosopher and was always dropping by the wayside. And secondly, I was interested in the social gospel. And so in the end I decided, well, the only difference between a Christian socialist and a humanist socialist is that the Christians believe they get some help through the Holy Spirit looking after them, giving them, some oomph. And but they both want to create a just and equitable society. So I was baptised in my last year, and I've been a Christian ever since. I used to say I was the only Jewish Methodist in Adelaide when I taught there. That's not even true now because there's no Methodists. They've become the Uniting Church. And in a number of autobiographical essays I've described this process in more detail. Well, that's basically, so I've always been a democratic Christian socialist since my undergraduate days. We've always belonged to a local church, or here we worship God in full term in Jesus Chapel. And we've been blessed with wonderful deans in Jesus, Chris Rowland and now Tim Jenkins. Yeah. So and the chaplain Jonathan Collis is a remarkable man. So we've been very, very lucky in that way. Well, not only beautiful music, but very wise people as mentors. So I graduated in '53. For 3 years I had been the blue-eyed boy of a woman called Jean Polglaze, who virtually ran the faculty.
How do you spell that?
Polglaze. But then she took her against me in a big way, unbeknownst to me. I got a bit swollen-headed. I mean, having been under the shadow of my brother, suddenly to become the star pupil. But all I needed, because I was always very anxious to please and to fit in and so on, all I needed was someone to say, look, cool it a bit. And I would have, but no, they let me go. Jean tried to stop me getting a first because she didn't like the dissertation that I wrote. For my honours, second year, where honours was 2 years and you had to write a 30,000 word dissertation the second year. But luckily Wilfred Prest, who was the older brother of Alan Prest, used to be in Christ's, said, oh, come off it, Jean. For 3 years you thought he was Keynes reincarnated. Now you think he's no good. Surely he's just FAQ, fair average quality first. So I ended up with a first, and I stayed on to do a master's degree by coursework, working for a bloke who, excuse me, who was in King's in the latter half of the 30s, a bloke called Richard Downing, R.I. Downing, who did the diploma here, I think. He was a great fan of Koletsky and Keynes. And he succeeded, he succeeded Giblin as the Ritchie Professor, which was one of 2 research chairs in Australia. Dick was an extremely able man with great talents, but a lazy bastard, and a really rather nasty piece of work as far as I was concerned.
He's dead, is he?
He's certainly dead. He died the day before Whitlam was kicked out. And I was then president of the Economic Society of Australia and New Zealand, so I thought I must write a tribute to him to all the newspapers, but because of the Whitlam kerfuffle, it never got published. So in desperation I sent it to the Times of London. About 3 weeks later I got a phone call from America from my friend Ed Nell, who was the former husband of Honora O'Neill, the principal of Newnham, saying, Geoff, are you dead? Someone just told me that they read Dick Downing's obituary of Geoff Harcourt in the Times. Anyway, I did a master's degree with him. He gave me virtually no supervision. And when I handed my first draft in, he had it for 2 months on his desk and then he tore it to pieces, which was fair enough. But it was full of sarcastic and unpleasant remarks, particularly about I'd become engaged to Joan by then. We'd met in our last year. And he read out some of my youthful carries on to the whole tea room, and they all lay about laughing and so on, because they'd been waiting for me to fall, as it were, until a chap called Ken Rivett, who was the younger son of Sir David Rivett, a very distinguished... Rivett, and whose brother Rowan wrote the best book on being a POW of the Japanese by an Australian called Behind Bamboo. He's a famous newspaper man. And Sir David Rivett started CSIRO, which is a scientific institute. Anyway, Ken was a very junior lecturer. He'd been a pacifist since he was 16. He's very unworldly. He stood up in front of the whole faculty, and it was a very hierarchical faculty, and said, "This is disgraceful behaviour for a senior person to be rubbishing a junior person like this. Now just cut it out." And he never told me he did this. I found this out afterwards. I thought it was the most wonderful act of friendship. Anyway, after about 13 rewrites, I got my master's thesis, being helped by one of my other teachers who was also working for Dick at the time, and he said, and was working for the government. He said, "Look, don't hand it in to him, hand it to me, and when I okay it, then you can pass it on." And that got me through. In the meantime, Dick gave me Fowler, the Fowler brothers, and Sir Ernest Gow's, which helped me to write. But of course it was done in an extraordinarily cruel way and knocked the confidence out of me for 10 years. But in the meantime, because of my undergraduate performance, I'd got one of the few scholarships, travelling scholarships. And so I was admitted to King's, and Nicky was made my supervisor, Nicky Caldor. And we got married, Joan and I got married a fortnight before we left to go on a 5-week ship journey, which I would not recommend to anyone for a honeymoon. If we wanted to get dressed, one of us had to go and stand outside. Joan was never well. We had 5 chums who were coming over to do their PhDs or DPhils at Cambridge and Oxford, and dear oh dear. Anyway, our marriage has survived. We're coming up for 52 years this year. And so we arrived, and while I was doing my master's degree, I'd met Ronald Henderson, from Corpus Christi, who had Australian connections. And when I arrived, he grabbed me and said, "Would you do some supervisions for me?" Because I didn't know that supervisors were slave labour to be grabbed wherever you could. And I said, "Well, look, probably, but I better go and see Mr. Caldor." So knocked on Nicky's door. Very gruff voice says, "Come in. Who are you?" And I said, "Oh, I'm Geoff Harcourt, Mr. Caldor. I'm one of your PhD students." "Never heard of you." "Anyway, I don't see students until full term. What do you want?" And of course, I didn't realise that Nicky was well, I knew Nicky was a Keynesian, but I didn't know there was these awful personal relationships between the Keynesians and the Robertsonians. Dennis Robertson, and that Ronald was in Dennis Robertson's camp then, and of course he'd been supervised with a bloke called Victor Morgan by Joan before the war, Joan Robinson before the war, but he hated Joan. He thought she was, well, disliked Joan intensely. He thought she was a snob and a bully and a zealot. So as soon as I said, "Well, look, I haven't come to talk about my thesis, Mr. Caldor, all I want is your permission to do some supervising for Dr. Henderson in Corpus." Well, because that was a red rag to a bull. So he said, "Well, what are you going to work on?" And I hadn't thought about what I was going to work on for 3 months, because I've been hurrying to finish my master's degree and rewriting it this 13 times. So I stuttered out something. "Utterly wrong," says Nicky. "Out." So I kept out of his way. He ran his own seminar in here, and I used to sit behind a column so he wouldn't see me at the research students' seminar. And what I was going to work on was the implications of firms in oligopolistic structures being as interested in secure profits as maximum profits, and the implications of this for macroeconomics, particularly for Keynes's system. That's what I'd written my undergraduate dissertation on. And when I said that this was the sort of thing I was going to work on, Robin Maris was there with Piero Sraffa when all the research students were gathered together. So he grabbed me and said, "You're first cab off the rank for the research students to give a paper." So off I went, having to write a paper as soon as I arrived. And I was too scared to say to Nicky, "Look, I'm giving a paper at the Sraffa's seminar, would you care to come along?" But anyway, Joan was there. Joan Robinson always attended it, and well, Sraffa was there and Robin Maris was there, because Robin grabbed me because he was writing his book on managerial capitalism at that time, so he was really interested in what I was doing. So I got through reading that. It seemed to go all right. Joan really surprised all us young colonials when she was a chain smoker in those days, and she said in this incredibly upper class voice when we were talking about business people's motivations, well, she said, puff, puff, I think the buggers do the following. So that was my introduction to Joan. I mean, I have to say that Melbourne economics was incredibly Cambridge orientated, so I was very well read in Joan, Richard Kahn and Keynes, of course, Marshall, Morris Dobb, Piero Sraffa, of course, had only done the Ricardo volumes by then, but his 26 papers and his attack on Hayek. So I knew a tremendous amount about, as an undergraduate, about Cambridge economics, and Cambridge was the place where Melbourne graduates usually went as a result. So it was like coming to heaven but of course, unfortunately, I was quickly kicked out of heaven by Nicky. And luckily he went away at the end of the term. I mean, I was in a deep depression. I was going to switch to the tripods, and I ran for the King's Cross countryside, but I used to fall asleep after lunch and then go home about 5, and I think one time Joan came home early. She was working at Heifer's at the time, and it was a half day, and she found me still asleep. I was obviously deeply depressed. Well, luckily Nicky went away, and I was transferred to Ron Henderson, and he said, well, what are you going to work on? And I told him what I was interested in. I gave him my undergraduate dissertation. He said, yeah, well, that's a good piece of work. I'm going to send you down to the National Institute. They're just setting up this series of balance sheets, profit and loss accounts and fund statements for the entire British quoted company sector. They want someone to write a couple of reports on it to see if they're of any value. So off I went twice a week to the National Institute and worked on these things. I wrote a couple of reports.
Is it the National Institute
of Economic and Social Research? Yeah. And it was under, who was running it then? Brian Hopkin, who used to be in Johns, and ended up at Cardiff. And so that was quite an experience. I must tell you how naive I was. Someone told me how to get there. You go to Liverpool Street, you go round to Westminster, then you walk down to Smith's Square. And I said to Joan, I often set my watch by a very big clock on the way walking down to Smith's Square. Yes, she said, yes, you do. That's Big Ben. And I hadn't realised I was walking past the Houses of Parliament and Westminster Abbey. Anyway, so Ron Henderson saved my life, in effect.
Did you ever get warm to Nicky Caldor? Or?
Yes, we... that's an interesting thing. Yes, we ended up good friends, and I wrote a very favourable review of one of his last books just before he died, and I have a letter from him saying how much he appreciated, because we were colleagues, for years after that. But where there were 10 years where we did not get on at all, and I'll tell you how that happened. But the only other thing I want to tell you about my PhD years, because it's very significant both for about the faculty, but also about my development, was that Joan Robinson published her magnum opus, The Accumulation of Capital, in 1956, at the same age as Keynes published The General Theory, and it grew.
What age is that?
52.
52.
And she said, what I'm doing is generalising the general theory to the long period. So she obviously intended Keynes's mantle to descend on her. And you know that Keynes had left his opera cloak to Richard Kahn, which was black on the outside and red on the inside. And Joan and he used to take it in turns in wearing it when they went out at night for grand occasions. But I remember once, I think I'd asked Joan as my guest to Trinity Hall. I was by then a fellow of Trinity Hall, this was in the 60s, and Richard was a college guest. And I came round to pick Joan up from Richard's rooms, it was a filthy night, pouring down, and I had a a car so I could take her there so she wouldn't get wet. And Richard came out and he said, well, it's actually my turn to wear the cloak, but since it's such a rotten night, very glad, he gave it to her to wear. And then after the feast was over, it was still pouring down, Joan said, oh, you've got a motor car. Would you take me down to Grange Road? So Richard was very disgruntled that I'd whipped off with his girlfriend and taken her home because it was such a rotten night, especially after he lent her the cloak. Anyway, that's that better not be on record.
Did she used to wear that cloak? She never wore it with the red on the outside, did she?
No, I think it was
Because
black.
I remember having dinner with her once. She was wearing a sky blue outfit or something.
Oh, that was the dress that her elder daughter Anne made for her inaugural lecture, I think.
Ah.
It was funny, I was just writing about that today, literally. Yes, because you know she succeeded Austin. When he retired, she got the chair, and just 4 votes to 3, the other 3 were for Nicky. And Nicky immediately found out the 4 who'd voted against him and sent him to Coventry, even though they'd recommended that he immediately should be given a personal chair. And then Joan rubbed salt into the wounds by saying, oh, if I'd known Nicky was so keen to be a professor, I would never have stood. But, which I don't believe for a moment, by the way. I mean, I believe she said it, but I don't believe she did want to be a professor. Because by that, you know, Joan and Nicky were very good friends, but also incredible rivals. And in the 50s, they had terrible boo-boos, with Joan trying to be conciliatory to Nicky, Nicky really behaving like Nicky could, and Richard having great pleasure, I think, in stirring the pot. I think Richard was a bit of a stirrer. I'm sure he had the highest motives in his mind. Yeah. So anyway, I locked myself up for the winter term with the accumulation of capital, and then emerged to read a paper over 2 succeeding weeks to the research students seminar on what I thought it was about, and with Robin Maris in the chair. And then Joan came along to the 3rd meeting so that we could ask her questions. And she thought we were a very trivial lot, that we asked about technical questions but not about the grand things. And it was reported to me some years, the next year actually, after the farewell dinner to Dennis Robertson, that Joan was on record as saying that she felt the research students were a rather poor lot. But I'll make an exception of a chap called Harcourt. Now, this couldn't be completely true because Sen was there.
Amartya Sen.
Yes, and Passanetti. And also an Australian friend of mine, Hugh Hudson, another King's man, who by common consent was the brightest of us all and was adopted by Joan and Nicky, and he went to the arts with Lydia Keynes and, you know, was really made a fuss of and won the Stevenson Prize. So, but anyway, that was reported to me, which I was very pleased. So that had a very considerable impact on the structure of the accumulation of capital. I've just recently written the chapter on it for the book on Joan Robinson and her circle. I lost this paper. It's a tragedy. I only had 1 copy, and in our various moves I've just lost it. But I would love to have been able to compare what I said then with, you know, my evaluation 50 years on. But anyway, that's one of the things of moving round. These things happen. But having just been through it again, I think it is a very great book, actually, and it was a tragedy that it didn't take on as it should have, which I'm sure she felt as well, because she followed up with 3 books trying to explain what it was, what in a much simpler way, what she was on about. But the trouble was that, you know, one of Joan's most famous remarks was, I've never learned mathematics, so I've had to think. And of course, as you know, economics has become increasingly mathematical. But every time someone tried to turn her work into mathematics, for example, their good friend David Worzick at Oxford, she got very cross. She said, no, that's not what I'm doing, that's not what I'm doing at all. And the only person I think she sort of semi-approved of it was a contemporary of mine, and also another King's man, the late Tom S. Macopoulos,
How do you spell his name roughly?
Asimacopoulos. Anyway, I can tell you afterwards. Yeah, he came a year before me and went home at the end of '56. But at the time, he and I and one of my teachers from Melbourne, a much-loved man called Keith Frierson, who was in Clare, we went to Jones' lectures on the accumulation of capital. Now, Keith just lapped them up. Tom was intensely irritated by them. Even though he came from McGill and had been taught Keynes and was a good Keynesian, he'd also been taught neoclassical economics, and he just couldn't understand what Joan was saying, and he just got irritated by it. As I say, Keith and I believed from our youth upwards, as it were. But subsequently, Tom went to MIT for his sabbatical from McGill. He went back and got a job at McGill in Canada, and he went to Solo's lectures. And listening to his lectures, he suddenly realised what Joan was on about. It was a St. Paul on the road to Damascus experience, and what falls from your eyes? What happened to St. Paul?
Scales.
The scales fell from his eyes, and he became Joan's firmest advocate. And of course, having been one of the leading young theorists in Canada, he suddenly put himself out on a limb because Canada was on the whole, very influenced by America, and America was either ignorant of Cambridge, England, or very hostile to it, and much more keen on, say, Samuelson and Solo at MIT, or Chicago for that matter. I think Chicago was a common enemy of them all. So Tom couldn't get his papers published, and a mutual friend of ours, an Australian chap called Murray Kemp, who opened the innings with me for one term for King's when he was visiting here, and when I was out scoring him, ran me out, as I always told me. He said I was just slow. Anyway, he had known Tom and thought him an incredibly bright bloke at McGill, and so he sent me this paper, which was a mathematical model of Joan Robinson's book. And I was the joint editor of Australian Economic Papers then in Adelaide, and so I immediately published it. It was a very fine piece of work. And Joan, as I say, became devoted to Tom as he was to her and the whole Asmakopoulos family. And she felt that he understood her, better than just about, well, there were about 5 or 6 people she thought really understood her, and Tom was one of those. And the only thing that they ever disagreed on was towards the end of their life was on the notion of the short period, where Joan said, no, this is an adjective, it's not a stretch of time. She changed her mind. And Tom said, no, that's impossible. It is a period of time. Otherwise, you can't do what Keynes did. And Keynes did have in mind a length of historical time. But when Joan died, he wrote an evaluation of her work, and he said, I've applied to her the criticism that she would have applied to others because she is far too important an economist not to do that. But everything I've applied are the criticisms I learnt from her of orthodox economics. And so if she has fallen short, it's because she's lapsed back into her previous past. And Tom's last book, which was accepted by CUP a week before he died of leukemia, just before his 60th birthday, is about Keynes and Joan and Harrod. A wonderful book. He was a wonderful teacher, Tom. Very, very clear and conscientious. Wonderful lecture notes. Hard on the students, but very fair, and insisted on we're in this together. Proper sort of teacher. Slightly aloof. He wasn't one to be called Tom by his students, but adored by them, and by Joan. Joan always used to go and stay with the Asmakopoulos when she went to Canada, where one of her daughters was living, and they looked after her very, very well. So, as I say, that was a very, very significant part of my own formation, reading Joan's book, which wasn't at that time directly associated with the research work I was doing, but I did, when I finally put the dissertation in, a part of it was adapting her model to cope with the things I was thinking about in my dissertation. And that's been part of my thinking ever since. So at the beginning of '58, I'd run out of money from my scholarship, but Joan Harcourt was by then the librarian at the vet school, the first librarian there. But I got a research assistant's job in Adelaide, and on the ship on the way home, there was a huge expansion in Australian universities associated with the Murray Commission, and there was a lectureship in economics at Adelaide, which I'd been interviewed for by Peter Carmel, the professor who was on leave in Belfast at the time at Queen's. And one day out of Colombo, I got a cable to say that I'd been made a lecturer in the faculty. Well, I thought heaven has opened and I've entered it, and so I had. The most wonderful 6 years followed in this very young department. I acquired my second great Australian mentor, another King's man, Eric Russell, who died young at the age of 55, but went through with Harry Johnson and I.G. Patel and Aubrey Silverstone, Frank Davidson, Robin Maris, immediately after the war. And he'd been a friend, he'd been a student of George Paul, the philosopher in Melbourne, who'd been a student of Wittgenstein. So Eric also went to Wittgenstein's lectures courtesy of George Paul, which he said was not a completely unmixed blessing, because he kept asking himself always, well, what exactly do I mean by that? And so he didn't, though he wrote like an angel, he left very little published work. What he left was, gold, marvellous stuff. Anyway, he and I became very close friends, and he was definitely my mentor. But it was an extraordinarily young department, and when I got there, I went there to be with one of my greatest friends from Melbourne, a bloke called Bob Wallace, who'd been just a couple of years ahead of me, but who'd gone to Oxford and then gone to Adelaide. And between us, we recruited some of the best young people who'd been overseas. And so the Adelaide department for 10 years was easily the most exciting department in Australia. And we had this very young Professor Peter Carmel, who's quite a terribly clever man, who'd been to Trinity, but had been through Melbourne with Eric. They were contemporaries in Melbourne. And it was just such a happy time, and so very fruitful, very productive. We had a most wonderful time, and I taught Joan Robinson, and I also taught a course to the intending honours students in the fourth year. Honours was in the fourth year, but you had a subject called economic theory, which was interim honours. And I said, well, look, instead of doing an encyclopedia course, we're going to just concentrate on Nicky Cowdor in his post-war work and see how a great economist thinks. And so I gave these lectures to a class of about 5 or 6 very bright young people, and between us we developed a critique of Nicky's models of distribution and growth, which we couldn't completely understand. I don't think Nicky did either, as a matter of fact. And that led, because what my PhD had been about partly was what are the interrelationships between firms' behaviour on the one hand and systemic behaviour on the other. And in particular, I'd made it a case study of what happens if you use historical cost procedures for setting prices and measuring income for dividends and tax purposes at a period of inflation. That's what my immediate problem was. But to answer it, I looked at relationships between individual behaviour and systemic behaviour. And so we investigated, saying, well, in Nicky's macro theory or Keynesian theory of distribution, what firm behaviour is he assuming in the consumption goods sector and the investment goods sector, especially as he assumes, this is this very eminent Keynesian, he was arguing that a capitalist economy in the long term must be at full employment, which led Samuelson to call him Jean-Baptiste Cowdor, up to J.B. Say. And so we worked out, well, I say it was a communal effort, but I did most of the work. We worked out what the behaviour would have to be in the two sectors for this to come about, because it was very peculiar. And so I wrote a paper called A Critique of Mr. Cowdor's Theory of Distribution and Growth, which I sent to Nicky, and though Nicky's a very shrewd bloke, but he said, well, you've got something there on, I don't agree with you, but you've got something there on what I've said in publications. I sent it to the Review of Economic Studies, where his original distribution paper was published, but the editors wouldn't have any of it, and then after a year of mucking around, they said, away. So I published it in Australian Economic Papers just before I came back to Cambridge in '63 for a year's study leave. And when I arrived here, and I came with off-prints of this paper, when I arrived here, I was made a great fuss of by Joan and Richard, and then I heard a rumour that I was to get a lectureship here, and I thought, this is just ridiculous. Anyway, one day Joan walked in with an advertisement for a lectureship in the faculty and wrote across the top, "Are you interested?" She sort of beckoned me out, in her imperious way, from the coffee room and handed this to me. And I said, well, I'm on leave. I've got a moral obligation to go home. So if I were offered the post, I would take it for 3 years by getting leave without pay. And the upshot was I did get it. But of course, I would no more have thought of getting a lectureship at Cambridge, which was probably the best faculty in the world at that time, and I would have thought of flying to the moon. In fact, it was easy to fly to the moon at that time. Anyway, I got this post, partly as a result of a paper that I wrote and then read on a nostalgic return visit to the Straffers Research Students seminar, which was attended by Mead, Bob Solo, Ken Arrow, Joan, Richard Carr. Nicky was in Australia, he wasn't there, and Piero Sraffa and Robin Maris. Wow. Anyway, they were really taken by this paper, and so Richard asked me would I join the secret seminar, this famous seminar that met in King's. It wasn't secret at all, just so those people who weren't invited would know.
What was it called?
It was called the Secret Seminar.
Was it? Mm.
Yeah, and it met in King's, somewhere around here actually.
Do you know which room it was?
It was somewhere in Gibbs, I can't remember where.
I mean, the Philosophical Society of which Wittgenstein
Yes.
was from, that was H3.
Yes, I've forgotten. I think this was on this side, but it was quite a big, well, it wasn't that big a room, but it's the subject of one of my favourite stories, which always makes people's eyebrows go up. May I tell you about the only time I slept with Joan Robinson? And the story is the following, that Richard used to always give a little dinner party at the Arts Cinema restaurant beforehand, and the regular people there were Nicky when he was here, and Joan, and Michael Posner, and then there was a revolving band. Anyway, I was asked to this the night that Ken Arrow was to read his famous paper on uncertainty in the economics of medical care out of the proof sheets from the AER. This was because he was, when I came back in '63, Bob Solo was the Marshall lecturer and Ken Arrow was here for a year as a visiting fellow at Churchill, and was writing with Frank Hahn general competitive, their standard work on general equilibrium analysis. So we had this, it was an incredibly cold October night, and we had, as ever, a huge amount to drink and eat. And we staggered over to King's on this cold October night, and we walked in this very warm room in King's, and there was a big couch. And there was Ken sitting in front of the fire, about where you are now, relative to... And Joan was up this end of the couch, and I was up the other end. Ken's a very boring lecturer. So he drones away at this. Joan went to sleep, and so did I.
That's the only time that you slept with Geoff.
No, that's right. Anyway, as a result of this paper, Joan came in with this advertisement and said, I think that was the culminating thing. They'd been making a fuss of me since I arrived. I was amazed, but there we are. I've been corresponding with Joan in the meantime, and she was saying, well, when you're back here, Solo and Arrow will be here. I want you to sit in and see that fair play is done. Oh dear, it was terrible. Anyway, I got offered a lectureship, said I would get 3 years leave without pay, and then Trinity Hall had never had a teaching fellow, and Sir Ivor Jennings had been the Vice-Chancellor's rep on the Appointments Committee. So he said, well, there's this young fella from Australia who's just been appointed. Let's have a look at him. And in the end, my election was clinched by the Vice Master, Charles Crawley, a dear old man. Did you ever know him? Lovely bloke in Trinity. Anyway, he said, well, look, even if it's a disaster, it's only a short-run disaster. So I became the first teaching fellow in economics of Trinity Hall. I had the most marvellous nearly 3.5 years here, and I never wanted to leave, but I felt this moral obligation to go home. And of course, not only did I get to know Solo and Arrow, and Ken and I became good friends from then on, so did Bob and I, even though we were opposed, because I was on Joan's side and he and Joan were at it, hammer and tongs. And Bob gave the best martial lectures I've ever heard, wonderful, about a mythical creature called Joan, a mythical creature called Nikki. And of course Nikki was away, but Joan was there, and she made Bob come and to her undergraduate class and debate with her. But she never gave him a chance to get a word out edgeways. She'd say something, Bob would say, oh, well, you've conceded that, now going on to... And I could see Bob getting more and more irritated. Anyway, he managed to keep... Well, no, actually, it really upset him deeply, because when the faculty was celebrating 100 years of the Tripos, he was the after-dinner speaker, and a lot of his after-dinner talk was getting it off his chest about Joan and what a bloody zealot she'd been and what a drawback on the faculty and so on. And he said it wasn't until Frank Hahn was appointed in 1960 and then as a professor in the 70s that Cambridge was dragged kicking and screaming into the 20th century as far as economic theory is concerned, single-handed by Hahn. Now that's overstating, but Frank was a very important intellectual influence. And not all bad at all. In fact, we really miss him. I mean, do you know Frank at all?
Yeah,
no? Yeah, well, he's the oldest enfant terrible in the trade, I always tell him. He's an intellectual bully, but he really was a very good influence on the whole, I think. And anyway, whatever you might think of him, he had a very, very powerful mind. And very adult lectures and proper lectures, I think, for a great university. And he and Nicky and Robert Neal in particular led a very courageous fight against the monetarists in the 80s or not 90s, but in the 80s, late 70s and 80s. And so, he was a very important influence here. Or as I say in that essay I showed you, poor fellows now confined to a wheelchair, which is very sad for him. Yeah, but he's still compos mentis. Getting back to the 60s, I mean, it was such a vibrant time, and of course we had the DAE under Redaway. Yes, yeah, and Dick Stone had been moved sideways to a chair, another King's man who you would have known.
Why were they all at King? Why were they all linked to so
Well, I suppose because Keynes, you see, Dick had been Keynes's protege.
So many of them
Maris.
talked about that.
Yeah, well, you see, King's was the mecca for economists in those days, and I mean, Keynes thought very highly of Nicky. He said he is such an intelligent man. He told Jesus, I think if he came to our faculty, we'd make him a leader. Because Jesus didn't elect him, because Jesus had a rump of anti-Semites then, so he wasn't likely to get a push in. See, Aubrey Silverson, who was an undergraduate of Jesus and taught by Joan, he never got elected there. And neither did Harry Johnson, who was also at Jesus.
Is this all right for the web, this romp of...
Yes. I think it's true. Because but the funny thing is that Ezra Benathan, would you believe it, was the first teaching fellow elected at Jesus in the end. And the story is the following. This may be apocryphal, perhaps you better not repeat this, but they knew that on the electing committee there were a couple of these old anti-Semites. So they put up a bloke called Jim Roseblade to get a mathematics fellowship. And one of them said, Roseblade, Roseblade, you mean Rosenbluth, don't you? I said, no, Alan, we mean Roseblade, fine old English name. Oh, he says, very discomforted. And now we would like to suggest Mr. Ezra Benath as the economics fellows, so he couldn't say boo to a goose. And of course they wouldn't give Jacob Bronowski a fellowship when he was a student. And then I think he was a lecturer in maths, though they made him an honorary fellow when he was famous. And of course Lisa Jardine was our first woman fellow.
Appropriate, as the daughter of Remark.
Yes, but just a little while after he died, and I asked Lisa, she said, well, I think he might have been a bit ambivalent about my appointment. Anyway, so as I say, the 60s was an incredible time.
But you went back to Australia?
Oh yes, I felt obliged to go back. And so I went back at the beginning of '67 while I'd been here, I'd been appointed to a readership that had become vacant, and as soon as I got back there, through Eric Russell, who'd been made a professor in the meantime, I was put up for a personal chair. They gave 3 personal chairs every 3 years in the whole university, and I was elected to that in September '67. And I went back determined to get stuck into the anti-war movement, because I was appalled by what was happening in Vietnam. I was instructed by Ajit Singh, in Queens, and Martin Bernal, yes, who gave me all the background material on it. So I went back very well informed. And of course there'd been a huge brawl in the faculty in the 50s, because Solo was 110% hawk, Arrow was a dove. It was interesting because they were both sons of immigrants, and often immigrant sons are 110% patriots, which in Bob's case was true. But Ken had an extraordinarily fine mind and proper moral values, and he thought that it was the most immoral war. And people like Hahn and even Mead were more inclined to be hawks rather than doves, partly because Joan, of course, was a raving dove. I remember once we were in Joan's study with Richard Kahn and Michael Posner, and I think Richard was late, and Joan said, right, we've got to write to Wilson. Tell him that his behaviour on Vietnam's disgraceful. So she wrote something out. Richard came in. She said, here, Richard, you send off this telegram, and I want you to sign it. He said, no, I'm not going to sign it. I'm on the crossbenchers in the House of Lords. All right, then, she said, you pay for it. And would you believe it, this shows how the influence of Oxbridge has declined. The next day, when I went into the faculty, everyone was agog, because a hand-delivered letter from the Prime Minister was waiting for me. And they thought I must have been offered some great post or something. But it was a page-and-a-half explanation of the case he was making on the Vietnam War. And of course we now know that what he did was right. I mean, he wasn't going to go out in front and slam Johnson, but he wasn't going to send troops. Anyway, so there was huge brawls in the faculty about this, but also about these capital theory debates. I beg your pardon. And one of the tragedies of my life was that Frank Hahn and Robin Matthews wrote the survey article, which was the role model for survey articles ever afterwards, on the theory of economic growth. And the first draft of it was to be read in the winter term to the secret seminar. And a chap called Jamshed Gandhi, who worked in the DAE, had come in with mumps. And I took it upon myself, very foolishly, to tell him to go home. I said, there's people here with young kids, and you shouldn't be in here when you're infectious. Of course, what happened? I got mumps, and I missed hearing Bob Solo discussing at the secret seminar, leading the discussion on the Hahn-Matthews survey of economic growth, which was a really highlight of the year they were there. But the day before I went down with mumps, Nicky had come back from Australia, and he'd asked me to come and read my paper on a critique of Mr. Cowdor's theory of distribution and economic growth to his King's Research Student Seminar. Luckily, Luigi Passanetti came along as well, because Nicky behaved disgracefully. Every time I got him on a weak point, he would either change the argument or scream at me, and then he would sort of, play to the audience, and they would all go, dear Mr. Cowdor. And luckily Luigi was there to see a bit of fair play, because I was going down with mum, so I felt terrible. Anyway, I staggered through it, and Luigi summed up and said, well, there's a lot to be said on both sides, as Luigi would. But I went up to some young fellow who'd been utterly obnoxious crawling round Cowdor, and I picked him up by the lapels and I said, look son, if you want to grease round Cowdor to get on, don't do it at my expense. And plonked him down. He was very shocked. Anyway, after that, Joan wanted to know what had happened, because she was having this, she thought, she'd been very supportive of me about this paper. She said, you're the first person who's really nailed the weakness of Nicky's assumption of full employment. And after my paper to the Research Student Seminar, she said, well, you have filled in a hole that's been left since Keynes died. And so that's why she was very keen that I should be appointed here. I think she was exaggerating. Anyway, that's what she told me. But the other thing, before I went into the seminar, Nicky had sent Hahn round to undo me. He said, so Hahn sat me down in the tea room and he said, this paper you're giving, he said, it's a load of rubbish. He said, your model's over-determined. What a bastard. So Nicky left no stone unturned. But it rather cleared the air, but it was 10 years before we became friends. But as I say, then we became good mates. Yeah. Well, when I came back on study leave in '63, one of the things I intended to do was to get on top of Piero Sraffa's Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities, his magnum opus, which he published in 1960, and on which he'd been working for well over 30 years. I met a young Italian-American called Vincent Massaro, who had come to work with Sraffa as well, or on Sraffa. So we agreed that we would read the book, and we would not go on to the next sentence until we persuaded ourselves we'd understood the one we just read. So it took us about a year, and because he spoke fluent Italian, he became very friendly with Piero. Piero was very nice. Piero remembered me from being a research student, and I remember the night of Bob Solo's Marshall lectures and then the party. I had been summoned to Piero's rooms in Trinity in the evening to discuss a paper that Massaro and I had written on aspects of his book. And that was it was a very hot day, and the chap who made the booze for the party had put 3 times as much gin in it as he should have. So we were all completely as tight as ticks. The famous memory of Joan Robinson, who was a great boozer anyway, but could take it. But she was standing there and she'd drunk a lot of this because it was so hot, and she didn't know how potent it was. And then she decided it was time to leave. So she turned round and she had on her famous Pakistani type pantaloons on, and she momentarily lost her balance. And one leg went up like a right angle, and you could see her tottering like this. And then as a random event, she headed for an opening, and by a fluke, she got through the one door you could go through. Anyway, I'd never had a car before, and I went out to dinner with Robin Matthews and Aubrey Silverstone and a bloke called Harvey Leibenstein, who was also visiting at the time. And then I had to leave to go round to Piero's. So I jumped in our little Ford Prefect. I'd never driven through town before. I went through like Stirling Moss, round corners round into Trinity, and up with Vincent to see Piero. And of course Piero was terrifying in argument. Everyone was petrified of him. He was the one person that Joan was scared of in argument. Anyway, I was so drunk, I came back good as, gave him as good as he got. A great night. And I remember then Vincent and I decided that we would do a review article of the book, and we got Piero to approve it. He approved everything we wrote. And just before we sent it off to be published, or to see if it would be published, we were discussing it with him, and we were discussing one particular point where I thought I found something not was wrong, but it wasn't quite right in the book. And I persuaded Piero that this was so, and also persuaded him that I thought of a way of fixing it up. So we were going through that, and Piero started backtracking. And I said, "But Piero, last time we discussed this, you agreed with me." He lost it completely. His eyebrows hit the ceiling, he screeched at me, "I am not the Pope, I am not infallible." Given his left-wing hatred of the Pope and everything he stood for, that really was something. Anyway, as a result of having to sit in on the debates between Joan and Solo and Arrow, and doing Sraffa's book, which was complementary to Joan's critique. In fact, Joan's critique was complementary to Piero's, actually, on reflection. I wasn't completely on top of what was going on, but I had read all the relevant literature and listened to these people discussing and so on. So when I went home to Adelaide, as well as being in the anti-war movement, I suddenly got this strange rumour that this new journal, the Journal of Economic Literature, had been set up with an editor called Mark Perlman, who'd done his PhD in Melbourne in the 40s, but was the son of a famous Wisconsin, the only Jew at Wisconsin, a labourer, historian, economist, who was at Pittsburgh. Anyway, he was in Australia visiting when he heard that the person he'd commissioned to write the capital theory survey had pulled out because he thought he would offend his patrons. So Wilfred Prest, my former professor at Melbourne, Alan's older brother, said, "Well, why don't you ask Geoff Harcourt? He's very good at explaining what other people say," in effect. So Perlman came over, and after a day's hard sell, persuaded me to do, in effect, a Hahn and Matthews on the debates on capital theory between Cambridge, Mass and Cambridge, England, which I'd sat in on and knew a lot about, but not really got fully on top of it, and doing Piero's book. So I got sort of temporary leave from the anti-war movement, locked myself in a secret room, and I usually had my door open so anyone can come in and talk to me, but I closed it and wrote, "Please only come if necessary, man at work," which someone tastefully changed to maniac at work. And I got cracking on writing this survey, and I was overwhelmed by it. So what I did was I split it into 5 working papers, which I then circulated to about 30 people, pro and con the Cambridge, England point of view. You know Joan, Luigi, but also Bob Solo, Jim Merles, Christopher Bliss, who's another King's man, by the way, and lots of other friends I had round the place. Got feedback on it, and Emily, these papers caused quite a stir. Do you remember Mario Nuti?
Yes.
Well, his then girlfriend, now his wife, Frances Welsh, was then the economics editor of CUP. And of course I sent it to Mario. He was one of my closest friends here from the 60s. And I like to think it was their bedside reading, because Frances wrote to me and she said, "I hear you've been writing these papers and for a survey in the Journal of Economic Literature. How about doing a book for CUP?" So, and that's what subsequently happened. Anyway, my publishing this survey really was a life-changing experience for me, because I suddenly became it was just the right time to publish something like that. And it was refereed, I found out, by Samuelson, Arrow and Joe Stiglitz.
Wow.
And someone else. And I got this letter from Ken Arrow, who said he was in at Harvard. He'd moved temporarily from Stanford to Harvard. And he said, "May I have your permission to use your brilliant paper for my graduate students at Harvard?" So that's one of my favourite possessions, I can tell you. And Samuelson, very magnanimously, I think, said, "Well, publish it as is. It's a very entertaining and rollicking sort of thing." Stiglitz, I subsequently found out, really slammed it Anyway, I had all this feedback from the 30 people I'd sent it to, so I fed that in, and it was I got it in I did it in about 4 months. I got it in time for the second issue, so it came out in June, I think, of 1969, in the second issue of the Journal of Economic Literature, to well over 30,000 readers. And then I got a Lever Humour exchange fellowship, which took me to Japan for 3 months over a long vac. And the money for that just covered the fares of a man and wife and 4 children of our kids' ages. So I said to Geoff Harcourt, well, what about, how'd you like to go to Japan for 3 months? She said, that's all right. So off we went to Tokyo, and I wrote the first draft of the book of the survey in 2 months, nearly killed myself. I worked 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, just as the selfish life of a scholar.
Did you see anything of Japan?
Yes, because I went and gave seminars, and the kids were taken care of. They were sent off on the bullet train and taken skiing and so on. But we went to a number of cities. We had a lovely time. We lived in Kugeyama. It's a middle-class suburb in Tokyo, about an hour from Keio. And I used to go in by public transport, and I read avidly on the way in, sometimes economics, but sometimes, Last Exit from Brooklyn, Holroyd's Life of Strachey, which had just come out, and all that went into my book. So anyway, my book was published in 1972, just as we came back to Cambridge in 70.
The book you have here, The Theory of Capital.
That one, yeah. Which just as we came back to, I had a visiting fellowship at Clare Hall, courtesy of Charles Feinstein, the economic historian, who'd been my contemporary as a graduate student, though we weren't unfriendly, but we became best friends in the 60s, mainly on the squash court. We played squash every Saturday, which we look forward to enormously. And so he got me he supported me for a visiting fellowship at Clare Hall. And we came back just as the book was out, and I gave upwards to 50 seminars on it, and I gave a set of lectures to the university on it, and it was
reviewed. I mean, widely reviewed.
It was very widely reviewed. One chap whose book I'd reviewed rather unfavourably slammed it, but and then Joe Stiglitz, whom I'd befriended here. He was sent here in the middle 60s as a graduate student by Solo and Samuelson to learn about the other Cambridge. And Joan Robinson very foolishly stereotyped him as a neoclassical fascist hyena, whereas really he wanted to learn, and he was a dove on Vietnam and very progressive in his politics. Anyway, Joan made very quick judgments of people, often wrong. And but Nicky liked him. And of course Frank Hahn looked after him. Anyway, Joe had the room next to me, and this paper I'd given to the Sraffa Research Student Seminar, I wanted to extend it, but I didn't have the maths for it. I was a very bad mathematician, even though I'd done mathematical economics as an undergraduate. So first of all, I asked Jim Merles, he was a brilliant mathematician, would he? And he said no. I think he had his fingers burnt with doing it for Nicky. There's a famous paper, Caldor Merles, in the Review of Economic Studies. So then I asked Joe, and Joe stuck with it for a week. He said, no, I don't want to do it. So at least I felt I had very good taste for my research assistants. Anyway, I befriended Joe, and I recommended him for research fellowships, and Michael Farrell grabbed him for Keys. And then we kept in touch. He went to New Zealand for his honeymoon. He wanted to come to Australia on the way. But then he was asked to write he then went back to Yale. He had a chair at Yale at the time. And the JPE asked him, Journal of Political Economy, asked him to write a review article, A View from New Haven, of the two Cambridges. So what he did was, he got out the notes he'd made refereeing my article, and he had a most uncalled for ad hominem attack on Perlman, which he put into this article, into his review article, And he really went to town, and he sent me a copy of the first draft. And I thought, well, I got on the 1st of January. I said, well, thanks very much, Joe. Great New Year's present. So I very foolishly, I think now, went through it with a tooth comb and got a lot of the howlers out of it, including one remark which I really treasure. He said, and some of the jokes are nearly as funny as Harcourt seems to think they are. Because by that time, you know, when I, because of my experience with Dick Downing, you know, I wrote in third person with not a glimpse of humour, but after 10 years I was getting a bit of confidence back, and I'd always crack jokes in lectures and so on. How else are you going to get the students through 50? Anyway, I always like to crack jokes. So I started to put, you know, what I thought were humorous remarks in my articles, and I really went to town in the first draft of this manuscript. And some of the chapter headings, as for example, Destry Cowdor writes again, and or excuse me, Miss Professor Cowdor, but your slippers showing, which was about an article by Passanetti on Nicky. Anyway, Joan Robinson, who is very witty but in an intellectual way, did not approve of my knockabout humour. But I, by that time, I was, you know, kept my own counsel on this. And of course, the undergraduates and graduate students loved it, because my survey article was a godsend to that cohort of graduate students who couldn't understand these very, very technical exchanges in the abstruse parts of capital theory. So my writing, you know, which I called a poets for poets account, was, you know, was marvellous for their generals, you know, their exams. So I had lots of fans from that cohort of, and of course, you know, it was the Vietnam War, it was the student revolt. It was exactly the time, and I wrote about the interrelationship of ideology and analysis and how they're intermingled and can't be separated out and so on. And I even had a section saying that was my view that if you plotted the Hawks on Vietnam against where they stood on the capital theory controversies, you would find a very good relationship between, which caused huge offence, but it was true. I said some of the Americans changed their mind when they thought they were going to lose, and that was Bob Solow. He switched and then took a very courageous stand as a dove. But it was a good predictor, I thought, but of course that caused enormous offence of saying something like that. Anyway, so you know, that was that was a great time for me, in the sense that everyone seemed to know who I was, and I much in demand for seminars and so on, having a lot of fun. But my mother had had a very bad stroke just before we left to come back, so we felt obliged to go home. And so initially we thought, if the kids like Cambridge and there's an opening, we'll stay, because I felt pulled up by my roots, and so did Joan. It was the happiest 3 or 4 years of our life in many ways, because the 60s was the ideal time to be an academic, and be an academic in Cambridge with that marvellous department, a lovely college, and living in Cambridge, and a salary which was more than adequate in those days. So we felt that so we decided we couldn't come back, even though Richard and Joan had set up a job. Really, it had been Piero Sraffa's job looking after graduate students. Piero retired by then. They wanted me to take it, but there was no way I was going to do that, much to their annoyance. So we went home again after this study leave. And then Joan had the bright idea I ought to go to Sussex. I think she had a map of economics departments in England, and blue for the neoclassicals and red for her lot. And she wrote me a letter which said, "They have taken Essex, you take Sussex." But I didn't. Donald Winch wrote to me, and I thought about it, and I said, no, if I go back to the UK or to Cambridge, that's the only place I want to go to. And so I stayed on in Adelaide, saw through, you know, the end of the Vietnam War. and decided that I would stay in Cambridge with Eric Russell, this other Kingsman who'd become my great friend and mentor, and we'd been through a lot of battles, both political and economics together, particularly on incomes policy in Australia and fighting inflation and the role of the Arbitration Commission. Then he died in 1977 playing squash while I was in Canada, because while I'd been here I'd met Donald Mogridge, who edited with Austin Robinson and Elizabeth Johnson, the Keynes papers, and then he went back to Canada with his partner Susan Howson, who'd been in Wolfson, and they wanted me to go to Canada, to the University of Toronto, in one of their campuses called Scarborough, which we called Scarberia, sort of way out in the sticks. And so they asked me to go there, and I took a term's leave without pay and went over there. And while I was there, Eric died, but they asked me, would I come? And I said, no, I'm not coming. I'm not going to leave Australia. My mother was still alive, but very ill. Very incapacitated. I felt we were obliged to stay there. They said, well, what about coming every year for a term? And I said, no, it's too much. I'll come every 2 years. Because it was a wonderful little department that had been set up under a man called Laurie Tarshis, who had been to Keynes's lectures. He was in Trinity. He'd come as an affiliated student to Trinity, and he'd gone to Keynes's lectures while Keynes wrote the General Theory, and then he did a PhD, which was really an independent discovery of Kalecki's macro theory of distribution, and then Laurie went back to America. He taught at Tufts. He fought for the Americans during the Second World War, liberated Rome, and found his second wife, Inga, who's still alive, and then wrote the first textbook, which contained Keynesian economics as he learnt it in Keynes's lectures. And it was published in 1947, I think, and it was immediately attacked by the far right. They got a woman called Rose Wilder Lane, who was the granddaughter of Little House on the Prairie, and who's that awful man at Buckley, William Buckley Jr., and people like that. They really, and so every department was going to prescribe Laurie's book, and this right-wing mob wrote to every department in America, and they all started to withdraw it. So instead of it being a great success, and it was a brilliant book, it had semi-respectable sales. Next year, Samuelson brought out his famous text and scooped the pool, and he got just the backlash of the right attack, but not nearly as bad. But he taught generations of Americans and all around the world Keynes in a wrong way, really, whereas Laurie taught it straight out of Keynes. And if people had been taught by Laurie's way, when stagflation came, they couldn't have been attacked. Keynesians couldn't have been attacked the way they were at the time and said to be discredited, because how could a Keynes model show that you could have both inflation and rising unemployment at the same time, which you could very easily show from the model in the General Theory, but not in the Samuelson model or in the Hicks diagram of IS and LM, which took over the teaching of Keynesian economics. So that was a real tragedy that Laurie's book wasn't the book that everybody went to. It was Samuelson's.
How do you spell his surname?
Tarshis, Tarshis, like Paul of. Yeah, wonderful man. He's dead now. But Inga's his lovely wife, who's terribly close friends of ours, she's still alive. She's well into her 90s. So
You went back to, you were now based in Australia.
I was now based in Australia. Then Eric died, and I was back on. We had long service leave in 1980, which meant that weren't meant to do any work, but So I went to Canada for the first part of 1980 for my second spell there. Had a wonderful time, and I made a friend there, a bloke called John Cohen, who took the place in my life that Eric had. We just gelled, and he used to drive me out to Scarberia. So we had endless discussions out there. We went running every day. We were just extraordinarily close friends. Wonderful bloke. He was an economic historian. He was a Berkeley graduate, taught at Yale, and then came to Toronto, and specialised in Italian monetary history during the interwar years. But also wrote a famous paper with a man called Martin Weitzman, who's now, I think, at Harvard or MIT, on a Marxist theory of the enclosure movement, which made a great splash at the time. And then I came to England, or we came to England with most of the kids in the second half of 1980. And as soon as I hit Cambridge, I suddenly became incredibly alive again. And they just started the MPhil, and they had to write dissertations over the VAC, and none of the regulars were there. They'd all shot off. So I virtually supervised all the MPhil dissertations, amongst these Italian students mainly. And then a lectureship came up. Mario Nuti left, that's right. He went back to, either went to Birmingham or went back to Italy permanently and resigned his fellowship here. And so they advertised a job. Now, in the late 70s, Robert Neild had asked me to apply for a post here. And that was before Eric had died. And he only gave me 24 hours to think about it. So I had a go, but I ran into, it was a lectureship. That's right, Michael Farrell had died, and they wanted to appoint someone to a lectureship but quickly promote him to a readership, is how they put it. So Robert, on behalf of the left, because Cambridge has always been split into factions. I say that the faculty has changed over its time, but it's had one constant. We're all bantam cocks on a dunghill fighting for our own position, and we define consensus as agreeing with what I just said. So I put in an application, but the Hahn was the theorist on the committee, and then there was Redaway and Charles Feinstein, who were both very close mates of mine. But what happened was that Hahn, they said they had to lean to Hahn as the theorist as to who should be appointed. But also the left had rather left me high and dry as well. Oh no, wait a minute, that's not right. No, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the irony of it, this is the irony, and it has to do with another King's man, is that I'd always told Charles Feinstein, who's my best mate from the 60s, you must appoint Mervyn King. He's incredibly bright. He's very, very good. Oh no, says Charles, I don't think much of him. Anyway, guess who got the job that I applied for? Mervyn King, which I was really delighted about for Mervyn, but a bit cheesed as far as I was.
He later became
the governor of the Bank of England,
yeah.
Yes. And he never took up the post, as it happens. He went off to Birmingham and then went to the LSE and then went into the Bank of England. But they also appointed a bloke called Gene Savin to take Michael Farrell's place in econometrics. So Neild was very embarrassed about this. He said, I've failed you. Well, in a way, I was annoyed that they wouldn't give me back the job that I'd had before, and Ken Beryl, whom I played squash with every Sunday. I told you I was called Radio Harcourt,
yes.
And Ken used me as the sounding board on what the dogs were barking in the faculty while we played squash every Sunday, and then went round to his place in Wilberforce Road for a very nice tea, courtesy of his then wife June. And he told me, well, look, I know you've only taken the job for 3 years, but of course you've got tenure. If you want to stay, we'd love to have you. So I thought, well, all I'm asking for is to get back the job I had, 15 years ago or so. 10 years ago. And so I was rather annoyed that they didn't appoint me. I'd used Morris Dobb and Joan Robinson, I think, as referees. Morris was...
What was Morris Dobb like?
Well, he was the perfect English... Oh, yes, a Stalinist, actually, but he was the perfect English gentleman, the most wonderful scholar. and you really were reluctant to ask him anything because he was so kind and it was all done in his own handwriting. And he and Joan didn't get on at all. She said he was a schizophrenic, you know, Marshall by day and Marx by night. And he thought that she was a wishy-washy liberal, lefty liberal.
Was he a friend of R.H. Tawney?
That I don't know, but he and Straffer were very close friends.
Did you know Tawney at all?
Yeah, I heard him talk once in Melbourne after he'd retired, and John Lennose, who'd been my economic history teacher at Melbourne, had him out. And I was enthralled. I've never heard such a splendid lecture. Really? These rolling sentences, you know, and such a nice old man, I thought, yeah. Well, I took my father along, and he thought he was a waffly lefty. And the week before, or a couple of weeks before, we got to hear Sir John Shepherd, who was out there. And of course he did his Churchillian act and so on, and Dad thought he was just the cat's whiskers. But I thought he's a bloody old fraud, actually. But anyway, we leave that in, why not? I'm not alone in thinking that. I knew him quite well because I had lunch with him every day when I first came here in the 50s.
Quite a sweet old man, was he, or not?
No, it was very sad. When he was at the height of his power, he had used it rather ruthlessly, and as he declined, people got their own back on him, and so he was very isolated. And
was he still provost? Or?
No, he just retired as provost, but increasingly as he got older and more doddery and more frail, he was very isolated, whereas Morgan Forster, everybody loved, and so everybody looked after him.
Did you know him?
Yeah, well, in a sense, I met him several times. First time over sewers, and he was jumping up and down like a schoolboy because all the King's Fellows had written a letter to the Times saying, get out, this is a disgrace, but they were waiting to get Richard Khan to sign. And of course Richard was torn in two because he had a sister in Israel. And so they were leading on Richard to sign, and Morgan thought this was a hoot. And he was telling me all about this. So that's the first time I met him. And then the second time was a very sad occasion, though it has a funny ending. And it's the following. It was when Hill killed himself. Do you remember Keynes's nephew, who was an oceanographer, who'd been a drunk? He's a fellow of King's. He's A.V. Hill and Margaret Keynes's son.
Really?
And anyway...
So Polly Hill's...
brother. Yeah, and A.V. Hill was a very tough father, destroyed Polly's confidence, and same with this bloke. Always thought he was a failure, though he's a very distinguished oceanographer. Anyway, he shot himself, I think, on Christmas Eve or some time like that, leaving a wife and 4 kids. And I was sitting next to Morgan Forster at high table. He's very down. He said to me, I hate my fellow countrymen and my college. Here this terrible thing has happened, and they're all walking round with stiff upper lips as though nothing has happened. Why can't we be like the Italians when they let all their emotions hang out and proper expression of grief? So I sort of tried to calm him down and chatted to him for the rest of dinner. And then I told Piero Straffer this. Piero said, what a load of nonsense. It's the Italians who are the hypocrites. I much prefer the way the Brits do it. And then the third time I had a long conversation with Forster was, I said, because he's my favourite novelist, so I said, do you mind if we talk about your books? He said, no, go be my guest, as it were. So I had a wonderful chat to him about his books, particularly the 2 Italian ones, because they're very democratic. And I said, as an Australian, that really appeals to me, your democratic side. But I loved his books, even though I think Howard's End has its weaknesses. Like Bob Rowthorne said he thought I would end up like Leonard Blast with all my books falling on top of me because my study is famous for its untidiness.
I've seen a picture of it, yeah.
Yes. Anyway, so in 1980, yes, I applied for a post here, and of course the faculty in the 70s and then into the 80s it had incredible left-wing, right-wing brawls, Tripos reform, and the so-called left was just about in control of the faculty board and the teaching office due to the institutional arrangements by the university. but not completely in charge. So what they did was they had a compromise. Every time a post came up, they say, well, it's your turn and it's our turn next, and they sort of interchanged. And people feel that this meant each side appointing a lot of second raters, but happened to be one of theirs. I mean, interchangeably on this. And there's something in this, not completely.
John Eagle was of the left, was he?
Oh yes, he was a protege. Well, Joan Robinson tended to have a 30-year-old young man who was her favourite, and also the son she never had, in a sense. And John was it for a while.
How did he get his lordship?
Through Kinnock.
Oh.
He was going to be Kinnock's right-hand man when Kinnock became Prime Minister.
Oh.
So the theory of the second best, he was made a lord. But he was very interested in political matters. But he and Adrian Wood, another King's man,
Yes,
had a marvellous man.
Yeah.
They'd been the bright young things of the 60s,
Yeah.
young Mr. Wood and young Mr. Eatwell, and they'd gone to Harvard together.
John Adrian went into the World Bank or something like that.
Yes, then IDS, and now he's a professor at Oxford.
Is he?
Oh yes, yeah, a great man. But Nicky thought he was, thought he was the man to carry on Nicky's flame with his PhD, which turned into two very good books, Theory of Pay and Theory of Profits. But then he became interested in development economics, and has been very influential. Anyway, they both went to Harvard, but John had been very influenced by Sraffa and Sraffa's attitudes. And Sraffa and Joan didn't completely agree on what was the most significant, well, they didn't agree at all yet on what was the most significant criticism of the conceptual foundations of neoclassical economics. And John, having been Joan's white-haired boy, sided with Sraffa through a man called Pierangelo Garignani, who's Sraffa's executor.
How is that spelled, Garignani?
Garignani, G-A-R-E-G-N-A-N-I. And he again had been one of my contemporaries as a PhD student, and he'd been taken up by Dobb and Piero Sraffa. And he wrote a remarkable PhD thesis called A Problem in the Theory of Distribution from Ricardo to Wicksell, which has never been published in English.
Wicksell?
Wicksell, W-I-C-K-S-E-L-L. Did you ever know Richard Goodwin, the wine steward in Peterhouse? Well, Richard was one of the greatest economists I ever met, and he fell foul of MacArthur, McCarthy, when he was at Harvard, and so he was a friend of Dick Stone. So Dick said, well, come to Cambridge. So he was in Cambridge for 30 years, and he became one of the best abstract painters here. But he was brilliant, a brilliant eclectic economist. And I think he was
Peterhouse.
He was at Peterhouse.
So he was with Poston.
Yes, but he was the wine steward for a long time, and he was a great friend of Joan's. He greatly admired Joan, he greatly admired Keynes. He'd been a Rhodes Scholar in the 30s and been Harrod's student, but he spent most of his time in Italy and Germany looking at painting, because he'd got cum laude, or whatever you call it, at Harvard to get his Rhodes Scholarship, so he thought he'd have fun while he was in Europe, because he came from Newcastle, Indiana. A terribly handsome man. Wonderful looking man. A great favourite with the ladies, needless to say, but a member of the Communist Party in the late 30s, because he thought they were the only ones fighting the fascists. And of course he'd seen fascism when he went to Germany and Italy on his painting trips. So then he taught physics during the war at Harvard, and his two patrons were Leontief and Schumpeter. But one of them didn't think he was serious, because when they appointed him, said, "Well, Mr. Goodwin, we want you to teach 8 hours a week, and we'll give you $12,000 a year." He said, if you don't mind, I'd rather teach 4 hours a week and have $6,000. So this was regarded as very un-American and unserious, because he liked to think as well as paint. Anyway, Dick Stone got him here, and he got a lectureship here, and he ended up a reader. They never made him a professor, which is just ridiculous, but there we are. They never made Piero Sraffa one either. And Dick did a lot of extraordinarily interesting and highly original work, building on the Cambridge foundations. And his most famous paper is one called A Growth Cycle, where he took the prey-predator model of, what's his name, some biologist whose name escapes me at the moment, to explain fluctuations in the share of profits and income. And profits and wages in income in a sort of Marxian, Keynesian analysis. Yeah, better. So he was a very important influence in the faculty as well. I think he was Luigi's either his examiner or his supervisor for a while, but he's a good friend of Luigi's. Anyway, when he retired, he was the first non-Italian to go in the competition and get a chair at Siena. And he had an incredible metamorphosis there and wrote his magnum opus, which was a theory of cyclical growth, which I published in a series that I was then doing for Polity Press called Aspects of Political Economy. I got a lot of very good sort of post-Keynesian economists and published their books in this series. Which Tony Giddens, another King's man at the time, was one of the founders of Polity Press with John Thompson and David Held. Yeah. So, because Tony and I were good mates and been colleagues for a long time. So Dick.
He was in the DAE, wasn't he?
Whom?
Tony.
No, he was a lecturer. The jewel in our crown in the 60s in the faculty were our sociologists.
Yes, they were associated. I mean, they were in the economics faculty.
They were lecturers in the economics. There was Philip Abrahams, who died young, John Goldthorpe, another King's man, David Lockwood, and then John Barnes came back from Australia and was...
Do you know John?
Oh yes, lovely man, one of the nicest people I know, because he's an anthropologist as well.
We have an interview with him.
Oh good, because he's got Parkinson's very badly. I went out to see Philistine, who's one of my dearest friends, and they live out at Girton at this old people's home. So I went to see Francis and John as well and had a lovely natter. What a nice, lovely people. John's always been so extraordinarily kind to me, I must say.
He's a lovely man. Yeah.
So very amusing too. Never took himself seriously. Very amusing.
His eyebrows going up and
down. But when Hahn came back and all these mathematical economists got stuck in, they didn't want the sociologists around. Oh, there was Jeff Ingham and Gavin Mackenzie, who also a very important part of the faculty and very good teachers. But they all got rolled and went off to SPS. And now we are the Faculty of Economics, not the Faculty of Economics and Politics. Stupid lot. Anyway, so...
the gradual shift, you say, well, quite sudden shift from a separate Cambridge tradition to one which is part of an American...
Yeah, modelled on the American system. For example, they partly centralised supervision topics. Half of the exams now are problems rather than essays. They teach from textbooks instead of making the students go and read the original articles. And most of they won't appoint their own. A Cambridge PhD is not acceptable.
Really?
No, because one of my best students, Michelle Badley, is a CETO in Keys, and then Michael Pollitt, who's one of my best undergraduate students from the 80s. I used to teach for Sydney Sussex as well as Jesus.
In relation to the famous...
Oh, I was going to tell you. Remember I was talking about Joan always had a favourite 30-year-old, but the one who's always stayed top in her affections was Brian Pollitt, Harry's son, who's another king. Of course, Brian was another King's man, who was beaten up by the Rugger Buggers just before his finals. And he was such a controversial figure. There were two schools of thought. One was that he'd organised this so as to get the sympathy vote. The other was that the rugged buggers were real bastards who'd beaten him up. Do you know Brian?
No.
He's a wonderful man. He was married to an Australian, daughter of a very famous lawyer communist, Penny Rolfe. And they were booted out after the Allende regime fell and came as international refugees to Australia. And I got Brian a lectureship for a week.
Booted out of Chile? Or?
Out of Chile. He was teaching in Chile. Penny was researching on charismatic groups in San Diego. Would that be right, in Chile?
No, not San Diego.
Yeah, one of the Chilean.
San Salvador.
Yeah, which became her PhD here, which got her a research fellowship in Homerton. No, not in Homerton, Hughes Hall. And anyway, I got Brian a lectureship for a year in Adelaide, and Penny went to work with my old Cambridge supervisor Ron Henderson, who had migrated to Australia and set up the equivalent of a combination of the DAE and the National Institute in Melbourne, and done a wonderful study of poverty in Australia, but also a lot of very good applied work which suited him fine. He had a very powerful Calvinist conscience, and he felt that he'd been born very rich, and so he could have been a gentleman scholar, but he felt that he had to work like mad and give it back to the people less fortunate than himself. But having been a Dennis Robertson clone, he was very liberal, and my master's degree under Downing was to do a survey of income and saving, a pilot survey of income and saving in Melbourne. And Dick Downing said to me, look, we'll try it out on Ronald Henderson because he's got very complicated finances, and if your questionnaire works on him, it'll work on anyone. So I gave it to Ron, and he filled it in. But he said, you know, if you came to me as a private citizen in Melbourne and asked me to answer these questions, I'd tell you to get lost. This is an invasion of privacy. And then blow me down if he didn't do this survey of poverty, where he asked much more indecisive questions, and moreover, you know, being a Robertson man, he was all into, you know, you can only use monetary policy, you can't use incomes policy or fiscal policy. By the time he got to Australia, he's all for incomes policy, fiscal. He did a complete switch. I used to tease him over that. Anyway, Penny went and worked there, but their marriage broke up tragically. And Brian went back to work with Nove in Glasgow, and where he still is, though he's retired. Subsequently married again, and like, you know, people who marry late a second time, went and had a child, idiot.
Is that to be put on there?
No, I can't understand. Remember Lord Young had a child in his 80s and then promptly died. Yeah, he was a silly man to have done it. I mean, he was a great man. He's one of my heroes, but what a silly thing to do. And Penny married Ian, the senior tutor of Queen's, who was a protege of Raymond Williams, and got rolled by the English faculty in their brawls there, Ian Wright, who's just died of cancer, poor man. And in fact, the last email I had from him when he was being treated for cancer, he said, there's an extraordinarily intelligent angel doctor who's looking after me. And do you know what her name is? Leonie Harcourt. She's a lovely daughter of my cousin Richard, the bloke who spilt the beans on me when I published this article on anti-Semitism. Yeah. Anyway, that's an aside.
One person I'd really like to, his name hasn't even occurred, well, it occurred once, and that's Friedrich Hayek.
Oh yes.
What are your views of his?
Well, I think he was a very brilliant economist, but in many ways a terrible influence because of his influence on Mrs. Thatcher and other people. But you know that I was interviewed for an hour and a half about Keynes and Hayek in Keynes's rooms here, you know, where Ian, your vice provost had rooms there.
Ian Fenlon.
Yes, yeah, he allowed us to do that, and there was a a best-selling 6-hour documentary called The Commanding Heights, done by 2 Americans. And they interviewed me and Skidelsky and Bob Solo on the Keynes Inside. But anyway, they did an hour-and-a-half interview with me. I think I got 30 seconds when the thing came out. But that's fair enough, they cut down everyone. But when they showed Friedman or Hayek himself or that, they would say, you can download from the web the entire interview with Professor Friedman. When they came to Bob Skidelsky and me, no. I was furious with them. Yeah. Anyway.
What about Friedman? You mentioned him.
Well, I didn't like Friedman. I think he's an intellectually... to be fair, I've never met him. And people who know, I mean, for example, Michael Bordeaux, who's here at the moment, won't hear anything bad spoken. You know, he was his PhD student. Have you met Michael, the Pitt professor? He's in King's. Very nice Canadian who's at Rutgers. But I think Friedman was an incredibly clever man, technically very able, but intellectually dishonest in public debate. And there's been a very interesting article in the New York Review of Books by Paul Krugman making that point, which led Michael Bordeaux to say, that's the pot calling the kettle black, because Krugman's a great, writes twice a week in the New York Times. And has been marvellous in attacking the Iraq War and Bush's economic policy and so on. And also has been selected to write the forward to a reissue in paperback of the General Theory in America, because the sales have been really down. And so Amanda Hamilton, who's the successor to Tim Farmelow, a very bright, enterprising Australian woman who's an economist, at Macmillan, well, Palgrave Macmillan, she had this bright idea of asking Krugman to write this very...
How do you spell his name?
Krugman. Right. He was a J.B. Clark medalist, I think, but certainly he was a young Turk, very, very well known both professionally and now publicly. Anyway, they're reissuing the General Theory in paperback with his very good introduction, actually. Very, very well done, I think. Anyway, so how do we get onto that?
Well, it was a long way around. I asked you about Hayek.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah. I never met...
Right-wing American.
Yes. Yeah, we were talking about Friedman. No, I think he was dishonest and, of course, very influential. No one's ever beaten him in debate, even Bob Rothorn. Do you know this story?
No.
Well, Bob debated with him on the BBC, and the producer was a friend of Bob, so he slipped him everything Friedman was going to do, and even Bob did his homework. Now, if you listened, as an informed person, Bob won, but if you were just tuning in, Friedman wiped the floor with him. And Friedman wiped the floor with Joan Robinson in Australia, because he was a lot younger than she was. But I've had to draw a curtain down over the following statement. You remember I talked about a friend, Keith Frierson, who used to go with Tom Asmakopoulos to Joe's lectures, who's been my teacher in Melbourne. He's one of the wittiest men who ever lived. And one of my favourite remarks of Keith was the following. He says, "The proof of the existence of God is the fact that when Milton Friedman sits down, his feet don't touch the ground." And I often use this in seminars, but I feel that a decent time interval should elapse before...
Yes, you put that down, yes. Well, we've got 5 minutes left for this tape, so it would be really nice for you to say either what you're working on now, hoping to work on, or something on Joan and part in your life. Or
well, the reason I came back to Cambridge in '82, because Eric had died and I was rather isolated in Australia at the time. Though I loved the department at Adelaide and had great friends there, and but I didn't have hardly any graduate students. I was rather isolated, so the major intellectual reason I came back was to write the history of Joan Robinson and her circle, to show what had survived in it and why it was more valuable in the way in which the profession was going, in my view. So to write the intellectual history of that, and that's what I've been doing ever since I've been back. Though I've been gone off into lots of tracks and lots of other things on the way, of course the other reason was that the cricket team was playing me on matting, and I want to get back on turf. That's now at last I'm writing Joan Robinson a circle with the woman I most collaborate with, this woman Prue Kerr, who had been my undergraduate in Adelaide and my master's student in Adelaide, and then I was her last supervisor for her PhD here, which was a splendid PhD, one of those PhDs that people know about before it's finished and want to read. So we're working away on that, though as I said, she's been ill, poor Prue. And when I've done that, I think I'll call it a day. And in fact, Joan, my wife, thinks we must go home in the next 2-3 years. 3 of the 4 kids live in Sydney, and she's worried about when we get decrepit, you've got to be near family. We have our oldest child lives in Rome. She has a reputation for her work on gender and development, and she is coming to a visiting fellowship at Clare Hall in October, 34 years after her father has done that, so that's very exciting.
That rhymes it up. But when you say you go home, do you mean you go back to live in Australia?
Yeah, we'll live in Sydney. We've got an apartment there, which Becky, our youngest, has been living in for 3 years, but we said we'd give her 3 or 4 years, but then she must find somewhere of her own. She's a very brilliant drama teacher, and our third child, Tim, who was born here, and is the most Australian of all the kids. He's the chief economist of Austrade. And then Robert, who was Pat Bateson's PhD student, he's a marine biologist at Macquarie. And then Wendy works for the Society for International Development, edits the Journal of Development, and has this reputation for her work on gender and development. And did the first PhD in women's studies at the ANU on the perceptions of women's illness by the medical profession in 19th century Melbourne. Absolute pioneering study. Nobody had ever done it before. Foucault-esque.
Well, I think unless there was anything else you particularly wanted to get in, it's nice to have you ending on a laugh.
Good. Okay, that's fine.
Is that okay?
Yes, sure.
It was a really wonderful interview. Thank you very much indeed, Geoff.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a great privilege to be asked to do it.